The Panther tank appeared through the morning fog at 200 yards. First Lieutenant Robert Lamison, commanding Charlie Company, 37th Tank Battalion, watched it materialize like a ghost. Then another, then 8 more. 10 Panthers, 50-ton behemoths mounting 75mm guns, advancing directly toward combat. Command A headquarters near Arracourt, France. It was September 19th, 1944. Lamison's Sherman tanks were 3,000 yards away, too far to help. Between the advancing Panthers and the command post were support units, clerks, radio operators, the division commander's staff, and 1 battalion of M7 Priest self-propelled howitzers from the 94th Armored Field Artillery Battalion. Artillery. Not tank destroyers, not anti-tank guns, field artillery designed to fire high-explosive shells in high arcs over miles of terrain. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The artillery crews had perhaps 30 seconds to make a decision that would determine whether Combat Command A headquarters survived the next 5 minutes. Major Hal Patterson, the artillery battalion commander, gave the order: load armor piercing, prepare for direct fire. The M7 Priest was never designed for this. The vehicle was a 105mm M2A1 howitzer mounted on an M3 tank chassis. The howitzer sat in an open-topped fighting compartment with 3/4-inch armor on the sides, 1 inch on the front. The crew of 7 included the chief of section, gunner, assistant gunner, loader, and 3 ammunition handlers. The gun could elevate to 66 degrees for high-angle fire. It could depress to -5 degrees for direct fire. But direct fire against tanks violated every principle of artillery employment. Artillery fought from positions miles behind the front lines. Artillery fired indirectly, using forward observers to spot targets and adjust fire. Artillery concentrated fires from multiple batteries to saturate target areas with high explosive fragmentation rounds. Artillery did not engage enemy armor at point-blank range over open sights. Yet, here they were. The fog that had allowed the German Panthers to approach undetected now worked both ways. The Germans couldn't see the American positions clearly. They were advancing blindly, relying on their superior armor and firepower to smash through whatever resistance they encountered. The M7 Priest howitzers were positioned in a battery position near CCA headquarters. 6 guns. Normally they'd be firing missions called in by forward observers supporting the attacking tank battalions. High explosive rounds landing on German positions 3 or 4 miles away. Today, they had different targets they could see with their own eyes. The 105mm M2A1 howitzer fired a 55-pound high-explosive shell to a maximum range of 12,000 yards, over 7 miles. The shell arc high into the air, following a ballistic trajectory determined by the gun's elevation and the powder charge. Time of flight to maximum range was nearly 30 seconds. The shell would impact at a steep angle, detonating on contact or with a variable time fuse set to explode above ground. This ammunition was designed to kill infantry, to destroy field fortifications, to suppress enemy positions. It was not designed to penetrate tank armor. The shell walls were thin, filled with explosive. On impact with armor, the shell would detonate on the surface, creating blast and fragmentation, but rarely penetrating. But the M7 crews also carried armor-piercing ammunition, not many rounds. Artillery battalions didn't expect to fight tanks, but doctrine required them to defend themselves if attacked. So each vehicle carried perhaps a dozen AP rounds mixed with their standard load of 69 high-explosive shells. The M67 armor-piercing projectile weighed 33 pounds. It was solid steel with a small explosive burner in the base. No high-explosive filler. The round relied entirely on kinetic energy, mass, and velocity. When fired, the shell left the barrel at 1,500 feet per second. At 200 yards range, it retained most of that velocity. 33 pounds of hardened steel traveling 1,500 feet per second carried enormous energy. The problem was accuracy. The 105mm howitzer had a short barrel compared to dedicated anti-tank guns. Short barrel meant lower muzzle velocity and less accuracy at long range. The gun's sights were calibrated for indirect fire at distances measured in thousands of yards. Using them for direct fire at close range required the gunner to improvise, to aim, using the barrel itself as a reference, to estimate lead and elevation by eye. And the Panther was a formidable target. Frontal armor on the glacis plate was 80 millimeters thick, sloped at 55 degrees. Effective thickness was over 140 millimeters. The turret front was 100 millimeters, also sloped. The Panther was designed specifically to be immune to frontal attack from most Allied anti-tank weapons. But the Panthers were advancing through fog. Visibility was perhaps 300 yards at best. The German tank commanders couldn't see the American positions clearly. They were buttoned up, hatches closed, viewing the world through periscopes and vision blocks. Their situational awareness was limited. Major Patterson's howitzers opened fire. The first round was high explosive, not armor-piercing. Standard procedure. The gunner needed to see where his gun was aimed. He would create a visible impact. If it landed, short or long, he could adjust. The round impacted near the lead Panther. The German tank kept coming. The loader slammed an AP round into the breech. The gunner laid the sight on the Panther's hull, leading the moving target slightly. The Panther was traveling perhaps 10 miles per hour, not fast, but moving. The gunner had to estimate where the tank would be when the shell arrived. He squeezed the firing mechanism. The 105mm howitzer recoiled violently. The report was deafening, even in the open-topped fighting compartment. Smoke and flame erupted from the muzzle. The AP round crossed 200 yards in a fraction of a second. It struck the Panther on the glacis plate, the frontal armor. The round didn't penetrate. It ricocheted, glancing off at an angle, sparking against the steel. The Panther's commander saw the muzzle flash. His gunner traversed the turret, bringing the 75mm KWK-42 gun to bear. The Panther's gun was one of the finest tank weapons of the war, muzzle velocity of 3,000 feet per second, capable of penetrating 4 inches of armor at 1,000 yards. At 200 yards, it could penetrate the M7's armor effortlessly. But before the Panther could fire, a second M7 engaged. This gunner aimed lower, at the tank's running gear. The tracks, the wheels, the suspension. These components were less armored than the hull. The AP round struck a road wheel, the impact transferring energy into the wheel assembly, breaking it. The Panther lurched, its track disrupted, it stopped moving. A mobility kill. The Panther couldn't maneuver, but its gun still functioned. The turret traversed, seeking targets. The German gunner fired. The 75mm armor-piercing round struck an M7 priest square in the fighting compartment. The round penetrated the thin armor, exploding inside. The vehicle erupted in flames. Ammunition cooked off. The crew died instantly. But now, more M7s were engaging. 6 howitzers firing as fast as their crews could load. The standard rate of fire for a 105mm howitzer was 3 rounds per minute under normal conditions. These weren't normal conditions. The crews were fighting for their lives. They achieved rates closer to 5 or 6 rounds per minute. Not all rounds were hitting. The fog made aiming difficult. The targets were moving. The gunners were artillerymen, not anti-tank specialists. They'd trained to hit area targets at long range, not point targets at close range. But volume of fire compensated for individual accuracy. When 6 guns are firing 5 rounds per minute each, 30 rounds per minute are impacting the target area. The German Panthers were taking hits. Most rounds struck the frontal armor and ricocheted harmlessly, but some hit weak points. Vision blocks shattered, track links broke. Engine decks, which had thinner armor, took penetrating hits. The Panthers began burning. The German tank commanders made a tactical decision. They were taking casualties without being able to effectively return fire. The fog obscured their targets. The American guns were well positioned, dug in or hull down. Breaking through would be costly. They withdrew, backing away, keeping their frontal armor toward the enemy. This action, this desperate defense by artillery firing over open sights against attacking tanks, lasted perhaps 10 minutes. When it ended, several Panthers were disabled or destroyed. 1 M7 priest was burning. The crew was dead, but CCA headquarters had held. 3,000 yards away, Captain Lamison and his Sherman tanks had been racing toward the sound of guns. They arrived at a commanding ridge overlooking the battlefield, just as the Panthers withdrew from the artillery position. 8 Panthers appeared below them, regrouping, probably preparing for another attack. Lamison's tanks had the high ground. The Panthers were in the valley below, their thinner top and side armor exposed. The Shermans opened fire. Within minutes, 4 Panthers were burning. The remaining 4 attempted to retreat. Lamison's company pursued, destroying all 4. This engagement near Arracourt on September the 19th, 1944, illustrated something American doctrine had always acknowledged, but rarely practiced. Artillery could fight tanks, not efficiently, not optimally, but when necessary, when the tactical situation demanded it, field artillery firing over open sights could engage and destroy armored vehicles. The concept wasn't new. During World War I, field guns had been pressed into anti-tank service when the first tanks appeared on the Western Front. The guns were depressed to fire directly at the approaching armor. It worked, but it was wasteful. Artillery ammunition was expensive and in limited supply. Using it against individual tanks expended resources better used for area bombardment. Between the wars, dedicated anti-tank guns were developed specifically to address the tank threat. These weapons had longer barrels for higher muzzle velocity, lower silhouettes for better concealment, and lighter weight for easier maneuverability. They fired specialized armor-piercing ammunition optimized for penetration rather than fragmentation. By 1944, every army fielded multiple types of anti-tank weapons: towed anti-tank guns, self-propelled tank destroyers, infantry anti-tank rockets, even specialized anti-tank rifles, though these were largely obsolete by mid-war. The proliferation of dedicated anti-tank weapons should have made field artillery obsolete in the anti-tank role. But combat doesn't respect doctrinal boundaries. Tanks attack where they find weaknesses. Artillery batteries positioned to support infantry attacks sometimes find themselves in the path of enemy armor. When that happens, the crews have two choices: withdraw, abandoning their positions and leaving friendly units without fire support, or fight. At Arracourt, the M7 Priest crews chose to fight. They had no specialized training for direct fire against tanks. Their doctrine emphasized indirect fire missions. Their ammunition load prioritized high explosive over armor piercing. Their sights were calibrated for long-range ballistic trajectories. Everything about their equipment and training was optimized for a different mission. Yet they engaged anyway. They loaded armor-piercing rounds. They aimed using improvised methods. They fired at targets they could barely see through the fog, and they achieved results, not overwhelming results, not the kind of kill ratios that specialized tank destroyers might achieve, but enough to blunt the German attack, enough to hold the position until the tanks arrived. The title of this story suggests a single artillery battery stopped 50 German tanks. That's hyperbole. The engagement at Arracourt involved multiple units over 11 days of fighting. The M7 Priests engaged perhaps a dozen Panthers in that one action on September 19th. Other engagements throughout the battle involved different units, different weapons, different tactics. But the core truth remains: artillery crews at Arracourt did engage German tanks at close range, using direct fire. They did achieve kills and mobility kills. They did hold critical positions against armored attack. The specific numbers don't matter as much as understanding what those crews faced and how they responded. The Battle of Arracourt unfolded across 11 days in late September 1944. The engagement between M7 Priests and Panthers was one incident in a larger tactical situation. Understanding that larger context explains why artillery found itself fighting tanks in the first place. General George Patton's Third Army had raced across France throughout August and early September. The breakout from Normandy, Operation Cobra, had shattered German defensive lines. American armored divisions exploited the gap, driving east at speeds that outran supply lines. Patton's tanks covered hundreds of miles in weeks. By mid-September, the Third Army had reached Lorraine, the borderland region between France and Germany. The terrain was different here, no longer the hedgerows of Normandy or the open plains of central France. Lorraine featured rolling hills, dense woods, and agricultural valleys. Good defensive terrain. More importantly, the Germans had time to reorganize. The headlong retreat across France was over. New units were arriving from Germany. The 5th Panzer Army under General Hasso von Manteuffel was assembling for a counteroffensive. Hitler demanded action. The American spearheads had to be cut off, driven back, destroyed before they reached the German border. Manteuffel's force included the newly formed 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades. These units were equipped with Panther tanks straight from the factories. The Panther Ausf G was arguably the best medium tank in the world in 1944. Excellent gun, heavy armor, reasonable mobility. On paper, Panthers outclassed American Shermans in every category. But the Panzer Brigades had critical weaknesses. The crews were inexperienced. Many had only weeks of training. The units had never fought together. Command and control was improvised. The brigades lacked adequate reconnaissance assets. They were powerful on paper, but untested in practice. The American 4th Armored Division, by contrast, was a veteran formation. Commanded by Major General John Wood, known as Tiger Jack for his aggressive tactics, the division had fought continuously since Normandy. The crews knew their equipment. The officers trusted each other. The coordination between tanks, infantry, and artillery was practiced and refined through months of combat. Combat Command A, commanded by Colonel Bruce Clark, held defensive positions around Arracourt. Clark was an engineer officer, not a tanker, but he understood terrain and fortification. He positioned his forces to take advantage of the rolling hills. Tanks were placed hull down on reverse slopes. Tank destroyers covered likely approach routes. Artillery was registered on probable enemy assembly areas. The German attack began on September 18th. Fog covered the battlefield that morning. Visibility was measured in hundreds of yards, not miles. The Panthers advanced without adequate reconnaissance, relying on their armor and firepower to smash through American positions. The fog worked against both sides. German tankers couldn't see American positions until they were close. American defenders couldn't call in air support because aircraft couldn't operate in the weather. But the Americans had better intelligence. They knew the Germans were coming. They'd prepared positions. They were ready. The initial German attacks hit Luneville south of Arracourt. Elements of the 111th Panzer Brigade engaged American tanks and tank destroyers in sharp fighting. The Germans lost 24 armored vehicles in that first engagement. The attack stalled. German commanders decided to bypass Luneville and strike north toward Arracourt, where they believed American defenses were weaker. This assessment was partially correct. CCA's positions around Arracourt were thinly held. The division was spread across miles of front, but thin didn't mean unprepared. On the morning of September 19th, the 113th Panzer Brigade penetrated CCA's outpost line. German tanks pushed through American screening forces, driving toward the command post at Arracourt itself. This was the crisis moment. If the Germans overran the headquarters, they'd disrupt command and control for the entire combat command. Units would be isolated, unable to coordinate, vulnerable to defeat in detail. The M7 priests were positioned near headquarters to provide fire support for expected offensive operations. Those operations had been cancelled when the German counterattack developed. Now the howitzers found themselves in a direct fire role they'd never anticipated. The engagement demonstrated several tactical realities about artillery versus tanks. First, surprise mattered more than capability. The German tank commanders weren't expecting to encounter artillery in a direct fire role. They were buttoned up, visibility limited, advancing through fog. When the M7s opened fire, the Germans had to identify the threat, determine its nature, and respond. That process took time. Second, volume of fire compensated for individual accuracy. A single 105mm howitzer firing armor-piercing rounds at a moving Panther had perhaps a 10 or 20% hit probability. But 6 howitzers firing repeatedly created a density of fire that made hits inevitable. Even non-penetrating hits had effect. They damaged optics, broke tracks, disabled weapons systems. Third, combined arms multiplied effectiveness. The M7s didn't fight alone. They were supported by tank destroyers that engaged from flanking positions. They were covered by infantry who prevented German infantry from closing with the guns. When Lamison's Shermans arrived, they completed the destruction of the German force. No single arm won the engagement. The combination did. The Germans attacked again on September 20th. Different approach, same result. American defenders used terrain to channel the German advance into kill zones. Tank destroyers engaged from positions with clear fields of fire. Artillery, both indirect fire from distant batteries and direct fire from forward positions, hammered German formations. The Luftwaffe officer Hermann Balck, one of Germany's finest armor commanders, later analyzed the Arracourt battle. He identified 3 critical German failures. First, inadequate reconnaissance. The Germans advanced without knowing enemy positions. Second, poor combined arms coordination. German tanks attacked without adequate infantry support, making them vulnerable to American anti-tank teams. Third, predictable tactics. The Germans repeatedly used the same approach routes, allowing Americans to prepare defenses. American advantages were equally clear. Superior intelligence meant Americans knew when and where Germans would attack. Better training meant American crews could execute complex maneuvers under fire. Excellent artillery meant German formations were under continuous bombardment, disrupting their coordination and morale. The 19 Tactical Air Command provided another advantage when weather allowed. P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers attacked German armor in the open. The P-47 carried bombs, rockets, and 850 caliber machine guns. While the machine guns couldn't penetrate tank armor, they could kill exposed crews, destroy soft-skinned vehicles, and suppress infantry. One American pilot became legendary at Arracourt. Major Charles Carpenter, an artillery observation pilot, armed his L-4 Grasshopper spotter plane with bazooka rockets. The L-4 was a civilian Piper Cub modified for military use. It was slow, unarmed, fragile. Carpenter mounted 6 bazookas on the wing struts and attacked German tanks from the air. On September the 20th, Carpenter spotted German Panthers advancing toward American positions. He dove through German anti-aircraft fire and fired all 6 rockets. Several hit. He returned to base, rearmed, and made 2 more attacks that afternoon. 16 rockets fired. Multiple hits on Panthers and armored cars. Carpenter earned the nickname Bazooka Charlie. His attacks weren't particularly effective in terms of tanks destroyed. Bazooka rockets had limited penetration capability against Panther frontal armor, but they forced German tank commanders to button up, to maneuver evasively, to worry about threats from unexpected directions. They contributed to the psychological pressure that degraded German performance. The broader context of the Lorraine campaign helps explain why the fighting at Arracourt was so intense. Patton's Third Army had outrun its supply lines. Gasoline and ammunition were in short supply. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, had decided to prioritize supplies for British Field Marshal Montgomery's Operation Market Garden in Holland. Patton's offensive toward the German border was halted for logistical reasons. This pause allowed the Germans to organize their counteroffensive. If they could destroy the American spearheads in Lorraine, they'd push the Allies back and buy time to fortify the Siegfried Line, Germany's western defensive barrier. The stakes were high. Failure meant the war would continue into 1945. Success might end it by Christmas. The 4th Armored Division understood this. They were holding positions that determined whether the Allied advance would continue. They couldn't retreat. They had to hold Arracourt and the bridgeheads over the Moselle River. Everything depended on stopping the German counterattack. From September the 20th through September the 25th, the Germans attacked repeatedly. Each attack followed similar patterns. German armor would advance through fog or darkness, hoping to achieve surprise. American defenders would detect them through sound or observation. Artillery would engage first, disrupting formations. Tank destroyers and tanks would engage next, destroying German armor. If Germans broke through, reserves would counterattack. The Germans adapted slowly. They tried different approach routes. They attacked at different times. They concentrated forces to achieve local superiority. Nothing worked. American defenses were too well coordinated. German attacks were too predictable. The casualty ratio favored the Americans dramatically. By September 25th, the 5th Panzer Army was exhausted. The 113th Panzer Brigade had been destroyed. The 111th was reduced to a handful of operational tanks. The 11th Panzer Division had taken severe casualties. The Germans had lost over 200 armored vehicles. American losses were approximately 50 tanks and a similar number of other vehicles. The final German attacks came on September 26th through 29th. These were smaller desperation efforts. The weather had cleared. American aircraft dominated the skies. German columns couldn't move in daylight without being attacked. They attacked at night, achieved nothing, and withdrew. On September 29th, Manteuffel ordered the 5th Panzer Army to break off the offensive and withdraw. The counterattack had failed. The Americans held Arracourt. The bridgeheads over the Moselle remained intact. Patton's Third Army remained poised on the approaches to Germany. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The lessons from Arracourt were studied extensively after the war. American armor schools used the battle as a case study in combined arms defense. The key insights focused on combined arms integration, use of terrain, and the importance of crew quality over vehicle technical specifications. The Sherman tank was inferior to the Panther in almost every measurable way. Thinner armor, shorter range gun, higher silhouette. German tankers called Shermans Tommy cookers because they caught fire so easily. American crews called them Ronsons after the cigarette lighter that advertised lights every time. Yet, at Arracourt, Shermans destroyed Panthers at a ratio exceeding 4-1. The reasons had nothing to do with the tanks themselves. American tanks were better positioned, American crews were better trained, American tactics were superior, American combined arms integration was more effective. The artillery engagement, the M7 priests firing over open sights, fit into this larger pattern. The howitzers weren't the ideal weapon for fighting tanks, but they were available. They were crewed by determined men, and they were employed intelligently. That combination achieved results. Field artillery doctrine changed after World War II, but not dramatically. Artillery remained primarily an indirect fire weapon. The development of specialized anti-tank weapons continued. Recoilless rifles, anti-tank missiles, and improved tank guns took over the anti-armor mission. Artillery focused on what it did best, delivering large volumes of high-explosive ordnance onto area targets at long range. But the principle established at Arracourt remained valid. Any weapon can be employed in roles beyond its primary mission, if the tactical situation demands it. Crew training, leadership, and tactical flexibility matter more than following doctrine rigidly. The men who fought at Arracourt didn't think about doctrine. They thought about survival. When German tanks appeared through the fog, the artillery crews didn't consult field manuals. They loaded armor-piercing rounds and fired. When tank destroyers found themselves outflanked, they didn't withdraw according to regulations. They held position and engaged. When tank crews faced superior German armor, they didn't surrender. They used terrain, coordination, and superior tactics to achieve victory. Colonel Bruce Clark, who commanded CCA during the battle, was asked years later how his force defeated a superior German armored force. His answer was simple. We had better intelligence, better positions, and better soldiers. The Panthers were magnificent machines, but machines don't win battles. Soldiers do. Lieutenant Colonel Crichton's Abrams, who commanded the 37th Tank Battalion at Arracourt, later became Army Chief of Staff. He often spoke about the lessons learned in Lorraine. Combined arms integration, use of terrain, aggressive small unit leadership. These principles shaped American armor doctrine for decades. The 94th Armored Field Artillery Battalion received credit for its role in the battle. The official after-action reports noted their engagement of German armor with direct fire. Several crew members received decorations for valor, but their contribution has been overshadowed by the more dramatic tank versus tank engagements. This is typical of artillery's role in warfare. Artillery provides critical support, enables maneuver, defeats enemy formations. But artillery rarely gets the recognition that more visible combat arms receive. Infantrymen and tankers fight battles that can be filmed, photographed, described in vivid detail, artillery fights from positions miles away, firing at targets they can't see, achieving effects that are difficult to measure. At Arracourt, for once, artillery fought where everyone could see. The M7 crews engaged targets at ranges measured in yards, not miles. They aimed using their eyes, not calculations. They saw the results immediately, and they held the line when it mattered most. The German counteroffensive in Lorraine was the last major German armored offensive on the Western Front until the Battle of the Bulge in December. The failure at Arracourt demonstrated that Germany no longer had the resources or the trained manpower to conduct successful offensive operations. They could defend, they could counterattack locally, but they couldn't achieve strategic objectives through offensive action. The American victory at Arracourt proved the opposite. American forces could defend successfully against German armor. They could coordinate combined arms effectively. They could adapt doctrine to meet tactical realities. They were learning, improving, becoming more capable with each engagement. The war would continue for another 8 months. German resistance would remain fierce, but after Arracourt, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The only question was how long it would take and how many would die before Germany surrendered. The title asks whether a single artillery battery stopped 50 German tanks at 3,000 yards. The answer is both no and yes. No single battery fought that exact engagement. But across the 11 days of Arracourt, American artillery batteries engaged German tanks repeatedly, sometimes at 3,000 yards with indirect fire, sometimes at 200 yards with direct fire, sometimes achieving spectacular results, sometimes simply surviving. The truth is more complex and more interesting than any simple narrative. Artillery at Arracourt demonstrated flexibility, courage, and effectiveness in a role they weren't designed for. They showed that soldiers with inferior equipment, properly led and positioned, can defeat superior forces. They proved that doctrine is a guide, not a straitjacket. Most importantly, they held the line. When German Panthers broke through the screening forces, when the headquarters was threatened, when the situation was desperate, the artillery crews responded. They engaged over open sights. They fired armor-piercing rounds at targets designed to be immune to their weapons. They achieved enough kills and mobility kills to disrupt the German attack long enough for the tanks to arrive. That's what mattered. Not the perfect execution of doctrine, not the ideal employment of weapons, but the practical result. The headquarters held, the defense succeeded. The German counteroffensive failed. The crews who fought those actions, whether in M7 priests or Sherman tanks or tank destroyers, shared a common characteristic. They understood their job was to accomplish the mission, whatever that required. If it meant fighting tanks with artillery, they fought tanks with artillery. If it meant holding impossible positions, they held impossible positions. This flexibility, this determination, this refusal to surrender in the face of superior enemy forces characterized the American performance at Arracourt. It would characterize American performance throughout the rest of the war. The equipment improved. The tactics evolved, but the fundamental approach remained constant. Use every available weapon. Coordinate all available forces. Accomplish the mission regardless of the obstacles. That lesson, learned in the foggy fields around Arracourt in September 1944, remains relevant. Technology changes. Weapons evolve. Tactics adapt. But the principles of combined arms warfare, of tactical flexibility, of determined resistance against superior forces, these remain constant. The artillery crews who engaged German tanks that morning didn't make history. They made possible the continuation of the campaign that would ultimately defeat Nazi Germany. Their contribution was tactical, not strategic, local, not global. But without that tactical success, the strategic campaign would have faltered. So thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.